The engine was off, but I was still gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me from floating away into the cold February darkness. 2:47 a.m. The parking lot of St. Michael's was empty except for my BMW. I could still hear Sarah's voice in my head, the way it cracked on the last word. "I can't keep praying for someone who doesn't want to be prayed for anymore, Daniel." She'd said it standing in the kitchen doorway, her coat already on, Lily's overnight bag in her hand. The phone buzzed again now. I glanced down. An email from Henderson and Walsh, our biggest client. Subject line, contract termination effective immediately. I stared at it for maybe 30 seconds. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I realized I felt absolutely nothing. Not panic. Not anger. Not even the familiar adrenaline spike that usually sent me reaching for my laptop at 3 in the morning. Just nothing. A vast, echoing nothing where my soul used to be. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. I looked up through the windshield, past the fogged glass, and there it was, the cross on top of the church roof, barely visible in the darkness, just a silhouette against the cold night sky. I hadn't been inside in years. Not really. Oh, I showed up on Sundays. I sat in the back row, my mind running through marketing strategies and quarterly projections while the pastor talked about grace and redemption. 10 years ago, I was the worship leader here. 10 years ago, I stood on that stage with my guitar and my eyes closed, and I meant every single word I sang. And somewhere along the way, I traded my guitar for a laptop, my prayer journal for a planner, and my faith for a 5-year strategic growth plan that was supposed to make everything perfect. Let me tell you about the last time I actually prayed. I mean really prayed, not the polite, sanitized, "Dear Lord, bless this day" kind of prayer, but the desperate, on your knees, tears streaming down your face kind. It was 3 years ago. I was up for a massive contract, the one that would put my firm on the map, and I was terrified. So I prayed. I bargained. I promised God that if He gave me this deal, I would come back to church, really come back, not just show up and check the box. The deal came through. I celebrated with my team. I bought the BMW. And I never kept my promise. That was the year the dinners with Sarah started getting shorter. The year Lily stopped running to the door when she heard my key in the lock. The year I started sleeping in the guest room because I was working late and didn't want to disturb her. The year my marriage began its slow, quiet death by 1,000 missed dinners and forgotten anniversaries and conversations that started with "we need to talk" and ended with me checking my phone. I remember one night, Tuesday, I think it was, when Lily was 8. She must have waited up for me, because when I walked in at 9:47 p.m., she was sitting on the bottom step in her unicorn pajamas, her eyes heavy with sleep. "Daddy, are you coming to dinner tomorrow?" she asked. And I said, I can still hear myself saying it, "I'm busy, sweetheart. Daddy's got important meetings." She nodded like she understood, but I saw her face fall before she turned to go back upstairs. I didn't follow her. I went to my office and answered emails until midnight. That's the thing about slowly walking away from God. You don't notice it happening. It's not dramatic. There's no lightning bolt, no dramatic crisis of faith. It's just, one day you're praying, and the next day you're not. One day you're reading scripture, and the next day you're scrolling through LinkedIn. One day you're holding your wife's hand during worship, and the next day you're sitting in a cold car at 2:47 a.m., wondering how you got here and why you can't feel anything anymore. Here's a truth I wish someone had told me back then: you can have everything you ever wanted and still lose the only thing that matters. And sometimes, the most dangerous prayer isn't the one God says no to, it's the one He says yes to when your heart isn't ready for it. I don't know what made me drive to the church that night. Maybe it was muscle memory. Maybe it was the last flicker of something: faith, hope, desperation, still burning somewhere deep beneath the numbness. Maybe it was because this parking lot was the last place I remembered feeling like I belonged. Like I was known. Like I wasn't just a job title and a bank account and a carefully curated LinkedIn profile. I finally let go of the steering wheel and opened the car door. The cold hit me like a wall, sharp, biting, the kind of cold that makes your lungs ache. I shoved my hands into my coat pockets and started walking. Not toward the church doors, I wasn't ready for that, but along the perimeter path, the one that circles the building and passes the old oak tree where they hold the Easter sunrise service. My footsteps echoed on the frozen concrete. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. And here's the thing about silence: when you've been running from God, it's terrifying. Because in the silence, you can't hide behind your calendar or your emails or your carefully constructed excuses. In the silence, you have to face the truth. And the truth was, I had become a hypocrite. I wore the expensive suits. I had the impressive job title, Senior Director of Marketing, a title I'd sacrificed everything for. But inside, I was empty. Hollow. A shell of the man who used to lead worship and believe that God could move mountains. I stopped walking and looked up at the cross again. God, if you're still there, I thought, if you're even listening to someone like me. But I couldn't finish the thought. The words felt foreign in my mind, like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. I was about to turn back to the car, back to the cold leather seats and the unanswered emails and the empty house waiting for me, when I saw something that made me freeze. There, on the stone bench near the church entrance, was a figure. A person. Sitting perfectly still in the darkness, wrapped in what looked like an old, worn blanket, a shopping cart parked beside them filled with plastic bags and what might have been books. I squinted, my breath catching. It was a woman older, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair that caught the faint glow of the streetlight. Her words landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. People don't come here at this hour to walk. They come because there's nowhere else to go. I stood frozen, one hand still buried in my coat pocket, the other hanging useless at my side. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead, casting that sickly orange glow across the concrete, and for a moment I felt completely exposed, like she'd reached into my chest and pulled out the truth I'd been hiding from everyone, including myself. The BMW. The title. The 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. All of it was just window dressing. I wasn't here at 3 a.m. because I wanted fresh air. I was here because I was lost. I was here because I'd run out of places to hide from the emptiness. I sat down on the stone bench across from her, keeping what I thought was a safe distance. Close enough to be polite. Far enough to stay comfortable. That's how I'd been doing relationships for years, close enough to look good, far enough to stay safe. My wife. My daughter. My colleagues. Even God. Especially God. But Martha didn't let me keep that distance. She turned her head and looked at me, really looked at me, and I felt something shift in my chest. Her eyes were the most remarkable thing about her. They sat in that gaunt, weathered face like two small flames that refused to go out. Her cheekbones jutted sharply beneath paper-thin skin. Her hands, wrapped around a dented thermos, were knotted with veins and age spots. But her eyes? Her eyes were alive in a way that made me uncomfortable. They saw too much. "You're wondering how I ended up here," she said. It wasn't a question. I opened my mouth to deny it, to be polite, to say something safe and non-committal. But the words wouldn't come. Because she was right. I was wondering exactly that. And I was also terrified that her answer might sound too much like my own future. So I just nodded. Martha took a sip from that battered thermos. The paint was chipped so badly I could see the bare metal underneath, and then she began to speak. Her voice was calm. Unhurried. Like she was telling me about the weather, not about the complete unraveling of her entire life. "I was a nurse for 30 years, she said. 30 years. Started when I was 22, fresh out of training, bright-eyed and certain I was going to save the world. I worked in the same hospital for most of those years, St. Joseph's, about 4 miles from here." "You know it?" "I did. My daughter was born there." I'd walked past the nurse's station 100 times and never once thought about the lives of the women standing behind it. I loved it, she continued. Every exhausting, heartbreaking, beautiful minute of it. I held the hands of people taking their first breaths and their last. I watched families fall apart and come back together in those hospital rooms. I saw things that made me question God and things that made me certain He was real. Sometimes in the same hour. She paused and adjusted the worn blanket around her shoulders. I noticed the frayed edges, the places where the fabric had been mended with mismatched thread, the way she wrapped it around herself like it was the only armor she had left. I had a husband. Thomas. He was a carpenter, the quiet kind, not the talkative kind. He could build anything with his hands but couldn't string together 3 sentences about his feelings. We were married 34 years. No children, we tried, but it wasn't in God's plan. So it was just us. And it was enough. More than enough. Her voice didn't crack when she said his name. That's what struck me most. She spoke about him with such peace, such matter-of-fact tenderness, that I almost didn't register the past tense. Then she said it. Cancer took him. Pancreatic. 3 months from diagnosis to the funeral. The words hung in the cold air between us. I wanted to say something, I'm sorry, that's terrible, I can't imagine, but all of those felt like insults coming from a man in a wool coat who'd driven there in a BMW. The insurance didn't cover enough, Martha went on, her voice still steady. We'd made our plans, thought we were prepared. But cancer doesn't care about your plans. The treatments, the hospital stays, the medications, it all added up faster than we could keep track of. By the time Thomas passed, we'd burned through our savings. Then I sold the house. Then the car. Then everything else that could be sold. She gestured at the shopping cart parked beside the bench. I looked at it properly for the first time. Plastic bags stuffed with what I assumed were clothes. A few books with cracked spines. And sitting on top, wrapped in what looked like an old dish towel, was a Bible, the cover torn, the pages marked with dozens of folded scraps of paper. The first night I slept here, she said, patting the stone bench beneath her, I thought I would freeze to death. It was January. The coldest night of the year, they said later. I had this blanket, a gift from a patient's family years ago, and I wrapped myself in it and I prayed. Not the polite prayers I used to pray when I had a roof over my head and food in the refrigerator. Not the "Dear Lord, please bless this day" prayers. I prayed like a dying woman gasping for water. I prayed like someone clinging to the edge of a cliff with bleeding fingers. She looked at me again, and those bright eyes seemed to see straight through my expensive coat and my carefully maintained appearance. And he answered. I leaned forward slightly. What did he say? Martha smiled, a small, knowing smile that creased the corners of her eyes. He didn't say anything. The next morning, Pastor David from this church came out with a cup of hot coffee and sat right where you're sitting now. Didn't preach. Didn't offer me a sermon. Just handed me the coffee and asked if I was okay. She lifted her thermos. I still have the cup he gave me. Well, I transferred it to this. It keeps it warmer longer. That detail hit me harder than I expected. A dented thermos with chipped paint, and she spoke about it like it was a treasure. Because to her, it was. It was proof that God had seen her. That He hadn't forgotten her. That even when she had nothing else, she had a cup of hot coffee from a stranger who listened to the Holy Spirit. When I had everything, Martha said, her voice dropping to something softer, more reflective, I prayed like it was a habit. You know what I mean? I looked down at my hands. These hands had spent a decade typing emails, signing contracts, gripping the leather steering wheel of a BMW that cost more than most people make in a year. These hands had built a career. They had closed deals worth millions. But in 3 years, these hands had not once held my wife's hand to pray. Not once. In 3 years, these hands had not wrapped around my daughter and said the words "Daddy loves you" and meant it with my whole chest. I stared at them like they belonged to a stranger. Because in that moment, they did. The man who owned these hands was not the man I thought I was. He was a ghost who had been haunting his own life. And then, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I started to cry. Martha didn't say a word. She didn't try to comfort me. She didn't tell me it was going to be okay. She didn't offer me a tissue or a reassuring pat on the shoulder. She just sat there, letting me fall apart, because she understood something I was only beginning to learn: sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is let them break. When the sobs finally quieted, Martha reached into the worn Bible sitting on top of her shopping cart. She pulled out a small folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, and pressed it into my palm. I unfolded it with trembling fingers. Handwritten. The ink slightly faded. Dear children, let us not love with words or speech but with actions and in truth. 1 John 3 verse 18. Let us not love with words or speech. That was me. That had been me for years. I said I love you to Sarah the same way I said I'll have the quarterly report to you by Friday, automatic, transactional, a checkbox to tick before moving on to the next thing. I told Lily Daddy's praying for you the way other people say I'll call you later, meaning well but never following through. But with actions and in truth. I couldn't remember the last time I came home before 9 p.m. I couldn't remember the last time I sat on the floor and played dolls with my daughter. I couldn't remember the last time I looked my wife in the eyes and asked her, not as a formality but as someone who genuinely wanted to know, how are you really doing? My faith hadn't died because I stopped believing in God. It died because I stopped loving with my hands. Faith without works is dead. That's what James wrote. But sitting on that cold bench, I understood it differently than I ever had in Sunday school. It wasn't about earning salvation. It wasn't about checking religious boxes. It was about this: you can say you believe in a God of love until your voice gives out, but if your hands aren't doing the loving, your faith is just noise. Martha's voice broke through my thoughts, quiet and steady. That verse found me on my third night out here. I'd been praying for God to show me what I did wrong. Why He let this happen. Why Thomas had to die. Why I lost everything. She paused, and I saw her jaw tighten just slightly, the only sign that the memory still cost her something. And then I read those words, and I realized I'd been asking the wrong question. The question wasn't why did this happen to me? The question was, who can I love while I'm here? She looked at me, those bright eyes impossibly kind. You've been asking the wrong question too, Daniel. I knew she was right before she said another word. I'd been asking God why my marriage felt dead. Why my daughter had stopped waiting up for me. Why I felt like a stranger in my own home. But the real question, the one I'd been too afraid to ask, was this: when was the last time my love showed up in my hands and not just in my words? I pulled out my phone. Not to check email. Not to scan notifications. I opened my messages and scrolled until I found Lily's name. 3 days ago, she'd sent me a picture, a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands. A tall one with glasses. A medium one with long brown hair. A small one with pigtails. Underneath, in the wobbly handwriting of a 7-year-old, she'd written, "Daddy, can you come home tonight?" I never responded. 3 days. My daughter had asked me to come home, and I'd left her on read. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. Then, at 3:15 a.m., I typed the words I should have typed 3 days ago. 3 years ago, if I'm being honest. I'm coming home, baby girl. Daddy's sorry. I hit send and felt something shift inside me. Not a lightning bolt from heaven. Not a choir of angels. Just a small, fragile thing, like a pilot light flickering back on in a furnace that had been cold for years. I turned to Martha. Can you? I stopped, swallowed hard. Can you pray for me? I don't remember how anymore. She didn't hesitate. Didn't give me a sermon. Didn't tell me I should know how to pray by now. She just reached over and took my hand, her thin, cold fingers wrapping around my trembling ones with a grip that felt stronger than it should have. "Lord," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "this is Daniel. He's lost his way home. But you, Lord, you're the one who goes looking for lost things. You're the shepherd who leaves the 99. So I'm asking you to remind Daniel tonight that your grace doesn't require him to be perfect. It only requires him to turn back. Give his hands the courage to hold on. Give his feet the courage to return. Give his heart the courage to stay." She squeezed my hand once before letting go. Amen. I stood up. My legs felt unsteady, not from the cold, but from the weight of what had just happened. Before I left, I unzipped my coat, the expensive wool one Sarah had given me 2 Christmases ago, and draped it over Martha's shoulders. She looked up at me, surprised for the first time all night. "Daniel, you don't have to." "I know," I said. "But love in action, right?" She smiled then, a real smile, the kind that reaches all the way to the corners of your eyes. "You're learning." I walked back to my car, the cold February air cutting through my thin sweater. But I didn't feel cold. For the first time in years, I felt something other than empty. Something fragile but real. Something like hope. The engine turned over, and I pulled out of St. Michael's parking lot. The streetlights swept across my face in steady rhythm as I drove, past closed shops, empty intersections, houses with darkened windows where families were sleeping. Where fathers were home.